Hi, my name's Sam, and today I'm building a lumber rack onto a brick wall. So I just moved into this new makerspace, and in order to optimize the area that I have, I want to build a lumber rack onto this brick wall. I have this 10 by 15 area that I can set up however I want. But if you watch my workshop move video, you'll know that it'll be filled with work tables mostly. So to get some extra storage space, I'll be utilizing the brick wall. After cleaning this space and fighting with this cabinet, I'll be ready to begin. Now, there's a lot of information and videos about building a lumber rack onto a wooden stud wall and onto a cement cinder block wall, but nothing when it comes to using a brick wall. And the standard information when it comes to joining wood to brick doesn't work for me in this situation. Compared to concrete or cement, bricks are way more brittle, so depending on what you do, it can easily break or crack. In doing my research, I found Albany County Fasteners. They were a great resource with a lot of good information. I've linked their channel in the description if you want to go down that rabbit hole yourself. Since I'm renting the space, and I don't want to use any permanent fasteners in the brick, the only real option for me are these double expansion anchors. Every other option out there is either too weak, permanent, or will crack the brick. After drilling out the appropriate size hole and placing the anchor inside, this anchor expands from both ends as you thread the bolt in, allowing it to distribute even pressure along the circumference of the pilot hole. If you use a normal anchor that expands only from one side, it'll make a wedge which can cause the brick to crack. In this specific case, I'm using the 1/4 option from DeWalt. I purchased these through Grainger along with the bolts and washers I needed to thread into the anchor. In doing my research, I found that these aren't supposed to be used for super heavy use, but I'm mainly going to be using these racks to keep the drum shells I make off the floor and for some wood. In total, I don't think I'll exceed 300 pounds. And according to the spec sheet from DeWalt, this is totally within the sleeve anchor's capacity. Just keep that in mind if you decide to use these anchors for yourself. For the design of this lumber rack, I'm basically making a modified version from the Wood Whisperer. The biggest difference being that I'm turning the stud onto the wide side. That way, I don't have a super long bolt going into the anchor. To begin, I'm going to attach an 8-foot support cleat above the conduit onto the brick wall. Off camera, I measured and drilled holes spaced out evenly for the anchor points, but making sure they will land on the center of the brick and not on the mortar. With the support cleat ready to go, I marked where the holes needed to be drilled onto the brick. For the best results, you're going to want to use a dedicated hammer drill. I find the corded ones work best and give you the cleanest results. If you try to use a cordless drill, the hammer feature on the drill isn't as powerful, and the hole itself isn't as clean or precise as compared to the corded. Just something to keep in mind if you decide to try this for yourself. This particular drill does use specific masonry drill bits, and it was at this point I realized that I did not have the bit size that I needed. No, God! So with that, I'm off to make a run to the hardware store. With that acquired, I can finally begin. Drilling into brick makes a lot of fine dust, so make sure to always wear a dust mask. I placed some blue tape on the drill bit to mark the depth that I needed to drill. The anchor will work best when the area is clean and free of any dust particles, so I make sure to vacuum it the best I can. Now, this is my first time using these anchors, so I'm eager to see how it'll fit. And it fits perfectly with just the right amount of room for it to expand. Knowing that I have the correct depth and size, I can continue to drill the remainder of the holes, vacuum them clean, and then place the anchors. I grab the 1/4 bolts I'll be using and feed it through the hole on the wooden stud that I previously drilled off camera. I lift the stud into place and match the bolts with the anchors and tighten the first one. Making sure it's level as I make my way across, I tighten the remaining bolts. And of course, I gotta push on it to make sure it's working. I measured the distance I need for the upright 2x4s. I mark one of the 2x4s, then align the rest and transfer over the markings. then cut them down over at the miter saw. With those cut, I measure where I'll be drilling for the bolt that I'll thread into the anchor. I also made sure to bring it up to the brick as reference, making sure it'll land on the center of the brick and not on the mortar, then adjust accordingly if needed. I don't want the bolt head sticking out, so I set up a forcing bit on the drill press and set a stop on the quill a 1/4 inch past the surface of the wood. With that said, I can drill all the mortises on the studs at the marked locations. Once those are done, I can swap out the forcing bit for a 5/16 drill bit that will give me a little wiggle room for the 1/4-20 bolt to find the anchor. And then I drilled out all the centers of the mortises I had just drilled. I marked the centers of where the upright studs will go, spacing them evenly as I can, making sure all the holes I just drilled won't fall on any mortar joints. Next, I stand the first stud in place, make sure it's level, and then temporarily tape it in place. Off camera, I swapped out the larger drill bit with a smaller one that will fit through the holes on the stud. I'm just using this to mark where I need to drill for the larger holes. I couldn't reach the last one, and since I didn't have a stepladder, I used some drum shells I previously made and placed a piece of plywood on top. And making sure that's going to work, I finish off marking the last hole. With all the marks located, I swapped the drill bit back to the larger one. Here, you can see the tape I used as my depth stop more clearly. From here, I drill, vacuum, and then place the anchor. Then repeat. To make installing the stud easier, I feed the bolts through the holes first. Then I line it up with the anchors and tighten the remainder of the bolts. And then repeat the same steps for the second one. With the third piece, there was one brick that was sticking out, not letting the stud be flush against the wall. So I marked the area where the brick was sticking out and cut a dado channel using the miter saw. Making sure it fit, I can repeat all the previous steps for the remaining uprights. With the upright studs installed, I can now make the shelf supports. This will be made out of more 2x4s sandwiched between some plywood. Since the studs are installed with the wide side facing out, I'm adding a secondary support piece on the bottom of the shelf supports. This will give me more surface area touching the upright stud to prevent any racking. I set up a stop block on the miter saw, allowing me to cut for the depth of the shells all at the same size. With all those cut, I move the stop block and cut for the secondary support pieces. For the sides of the shelf supports, I'll be using one sheet of plywood. I first cut it down to depth, which would be the size of your 2x4s that you just cut, plus the thickness of the stud on the wall. I move the fence, then rotate the plywood to cut the height for all the shelves. To reduce weight and not make it look so bulky, I'm going to cut off the corners. After marking the desired angle, I use one of the pieces to join the 2 points. And then cut off all the corners on the bandsaw. With all the shelf components complete, I can begin to assemble. I first screw on the support block flush with the back of the deeper 2x4. Then I align the sides to the front of the supports and screw it in place, giving me the perfect space in the back to be able to screw to the sides of the upright studs. I use a strip of plywood tall enough to where my head won't bump into it to rest the shelf support on. Then, placing a level on top, I can adjust it and then screw it into place. And of course, I gotta check to see if it can hold me up, which it does.
Nice.
With the first shelf support installed, I repeat the same steps for the bottom row of supports. As I made my way across, I did use a level spanning the distance between each support, making sure they were plumb with one another. For the second shelf, I followed the same steps, except this time the plywood spacer just sits on the shelf below. Using a level, I make sure that this support is plumb with the previous one as I make my way across, and then screw it into place. As I mentioned earlier, I'm mainly going to be using this to keep the drum shells I make off the floor. So I cut the remaining plywood I had left over to use it as a shelf base. Since this is scrap ply, I didn't have a big enough piece to span the whole way. After securing those in place, I can measure and cut a piece for the middle. With that screwed in place, I can call it done. With the wall complete, I can finally store the drum shells I had previously made onto the rack instead of just sitting on the floor. And I know I'll probably get some people writing in the comments saying that these anchors aren't meant for that or this will fall down. But in actuality, this was recorded over 2.5 years ago and it still hasn't fallen down after using it. So I don't know, use at your own discretion? If you haven't already done so and want to see how I moved into this shared makerspace practically by myself, you should go watch the previous video. In it, you'll see how I set up the space and the decisions behind it. That's it for this one. If you want to see what's in store and what I'll be making next, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. The only real option for me are these double expansion anchors. Oh. All right, let's try that again.